we're ready to go.
You've been wandering around Canabine Township for the past 3 days with sticks and, and reviewing things. What have you found?
Well, we recorded 98 features, and of those, 8 of them were certainly houses. Quite a lot were just little piles of stone, clearance cairns, where they were clearing stones out of the fields they were growing. That's mostly what it was. It was houses, enclosures and yards around the houses for their cow yards, or their keeping the sheep and the cattle in or out. And then the houses. But so there's several things that struck me when we were doing this, and one of them was especially today when it was so windy, but all the other days as well, how really brilliant they were at finding sheltered places for their houses. So they're tucked down in the little valleys, behind little knolls of outcrop, and when you go to where the house is, it's sheltered, it's calm, you're not being buffeted by the wind. It was really quite good. And then poor Charlotte was up on the top of the hill, blowing away. I was down in the valley with my little stick. So that was one of the things that I was struck by.
8 houses. We've kind of got a record of 14 houses with 10 families.
Yeah, I know. One of those 8 houses may have been actually 2 buildings. And then there are 2 or 3 other places where what's left now is a big pile of rubble, boulders and small stones and all kinds of stones, and a great big pile, a meter high and 2 meters long. And I think we'll have to see what they look like on the map once you read it, because they're also just in deep bracken. It may be, I have a feeling that some of those may be the remains of houses that were just completely destroyed when people were forced to leave, or when they were abandoned. But it looked like they were forced to leave, and the walls were just knocked down and piled up at one end and just completely obliterated. So I'm wondering if some of those 10 houses have been so destroyed that they're not really recognizable as houses anymore. And they might show up on the map that's created by the survey that we did as 2 piles of stone at the sort of proper distance from each other to have been 2 gable walls. And it might be possible to discern some patterns in the various bits and pieces of walls that we recorded in the bracken that would show that they were buildings. It's also possible that there are things we just didn't find, that because the bracken was so deep, we just couldn't see it. We traipsed around, we cut down a whole ton of bracken, we trampled it all over the place, but it's possible that we missed some, as is always the case. We tried hard not to.
I know
so, 8 of them were for sure, definitely, no question asked, buildings.
And were they all of a similar kind of building, could you see from what you saw?
There was some variation in them, and from the degree to which we were looking at, just doing the survey, the variation is mostly in the shape of them. Do they have rounded ends, gable ends? Do they have square gable ends? And there were some of both of those. There were some that were sort of more rounded at both ends. Most of them were quite rectangular, with quite square ends, actually, which from other places would suggest that they were later houses. But they may have been later houses that were sort of reconstructed on the site of an earlier house. That's what we found at Clebrec, certainly. A house that looked like it might be a later house ended up having depth to it. So that's the kind of, and how big they are, how long they are, how narrow they are, how wide they are, how many compartments they had. How upstanding they were or how destroyed they were. Even that house that has the clear, upstanding, rounded end gable wall is there's so much tumble and just piles of rock inside of it. That's to suggest to me that somebody intentionally destroyed a lot of those walls and just piled things up next to the end wall.
So the kind of supposition that maybe that was left for an elderly person to live their life.
Yeah.
And then it would be knocked down.
Down after the person left.
Well, that kind of leads on to what you were looking at in more detail, Olivia. The difference in the houses is sometimes distinguished with the fireplace, where it's situated to the level of economic development, perhaps.
Yeah, or period of time when it was built. Because the traditional longhouse had a hearth in the center of the floor in the living area, and the smoke would go out through a hole in the roof. And that's very, very old. I mean, the Norse longhouses had that, and you find it right through the medieval period in Scotland, where medieval houses have been found. Typical longhouse with animals in the byre at one end, over the winter certainly, and humans in the other, living around this central hearth. And that's something that when people were being cleared and all over Highlands of Scotland and the islands, and landowners were trying to encourage them to change their way of life and build houses out of stone or mortared, and landowners who lived in posh houses in Edinburgh or London thought these central hearths were very unhealthy because the smoke was just all over, going through the house, and so they wanted to get people to build houses with fireplaces in the gable. It was one of the things they thought should change, and people resisted it because the central hearth had been the center of family life, and you could move around it, you could do all sorts of things around it. A hearth in the center of the floor as opposed to the end of the room has different effects on social interaction, the family interaction, and how people arrange themselves. And so it's quite a big symbolic thing to move your fireplace to a different part of the house. So in one of the houses that we've opened up, the longhouse nearest the road, we've opened a trench at one end where it looked like there might be a fireplace in the gable, and sure enough there is one. It had been blocked up at some point, and we're not sure why or when, but it was certainly, the wall was built to contain a fireplace. So that suggests that it was built pretty late, in the early 1800s, I would say, maybe even just a few years before the township was cleared. Difficult to say, but it's been a late addition to the township. And then another longhouse that we've just opened the trench over, we haven't done anything in it yet, but it looks like there could be a central hearth in that one. We're hoping that it'll turn out to be there. So that would be a nice contrast. We'd have the older tradition and these newfangled ways that people were building just before the clearances.
There's also different, by that one where you've opened the new trench, there seems to be some different ideas about dividing up the land, because it's a great big longhouse, and there are little walls running north and south, more or less, that seem to run at right angles to the ends of some of the rooms of that house, or the ends of another house, and there's 3 of them, and one of them is really ephemeral, as though it was like the old one, and then they got rid of that and put 2 other ones up. But the other places, you see a little house with an enclosure around it, and in that particular place you see a house with like strips of like the Crofton garden strips, and I don't know if that's what that is, but it looks like there's some differences. There's other places where there's terraces, and there's no ridge and furrow, and there's no rig in those terraces, no lazy beds, they're just flat. And I don't know if that's a different way of farming, earlier or later, or just because there's no point in putting rig in that in that little squares patch. So there's those kind of variations too. But that third house will be interesting.
Yeah. So hopefully we'll get glimpses of how things changed in the township through time. When we've got this very late house, and some of those fields, terraces could be earlier. Well, it's hard to date them really, but if we could start to work out, what we see on the ground, as Amy and Charlotte have been recording, and if we can start to kind of put a timeline on that, a little bit of an understanding of how the township developed and how people changed the way they built or lived or farmed through time, that would be good.
Yeah. Just on that before we go to the specifics and any finds that you made, it is a fair assumption that township did develop over a long period.
So certainly over 200 or 300 years. I think the earliest written records are in the 1600s, but it could have been in existence before that. As Amy said, it's very sheltered spots. It's pretty good ground, and then there's this possible early Christian monastic site just off the coast there. So we could be looking at quite a long time span.
Staying on the houses, then what have you found in the house that might be of help to kind of give more of a story to it?
Well, the house with the gable end fireplace also has plaster still adhering to the wall just beside the fireplace. And the other side of the fireplace, there's plaster that's fallen off the wall and just after the house went out of use or was abandoned. So we're working down through those layers and getting down into floor deposits and finding what looks like window glass. Could be glass from a lantern or both. Some sherds of pottery, decorated pottery, and bottle glass. And so we're getting some little clues to how people furnish their houses, the kind of things they used.
Great. And the second site that you've excavated isn't a house as such. Could you tell me about that?
Well, it probably was a longhouse in the traditional sense that I mentioned, with the byre at one end and the living quarters at the other. And we're just looking at the byre end, what would have been the byre end, where you can see there's a drain runs through the wall. So we've opened a trench inside to have a look at that drain. So it would have been where the cattle were brought in and kept over the winter, but they wouldn't have survived out on the hills. They had to be kept inside. And their heat helped keep the people warm during the winter as well. So it's just a very tightly packed rubble drain that would have carried all the liquid waste out through the lower end of the house, through the wall, and made it a little bit less smelly.
Right, well, I
And
know
less damp.
Yeah.
that site you're practically finished with, you
Yeah.
indicated, yes.
Yeah.
And I know that you're still working on the other one, so
Yeah.
we'll not push for conclusions to that. So, thanks, I think, unless there's anything else you want to say at this point.
I don't know that I have anything
This is your
else to
last.
say. My last
Your
big
last
chance to say anything.
Okay.
That they really made the best use of all the little bits and pieces. So it's very rocky in places, and it's very up and down. You know, there's sort of steep-sided valleys with the little burns running through, and every place where they could have farmed, they found some little way to farm it or to grow some kind of crops on it, and they put their houses in the places where they would be sheltered, and it seemed intensively used in a small area, but also really efficiently used. And most of the houses it would have been quite a friendly place. I mean, you could see all the houses from each other. They're not right smack on top of each other, except for the three. By the one where they're excavating the byre, there's three right close to each other. And then all the other ones are scattered along the terraces and along behind the little hillocks. But you could have seen each other, and seen the lights in each other's houses, and gone for visits.
Thanks.
It was nice.